A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Marley was dead to begin with. There must be no doubt whatsoever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. And Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard the coffin nail as the deadliest form of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed mind shall not disturb it, or this country is done for. Permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he had been partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assignee, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event. But there is no doubt whatsoever that Marley was dead. Now, this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come from the story that I'm about to relate. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood years afterward above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, wrenching, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel ever struck out to generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheeks, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, and no wintry weather chilled him. Nobody ever stopped him on the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children ever asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind man's dog appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming, would tug their owners into doorways and courtyards. "Ruh-roh, we're on the real ride. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning the human sympathy to keep its distance. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and you could hear the people in the street outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts, stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like a single coal. Wherefore the clerk put upon his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that it was the first intimation they had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug! Christmas, a humbug! Uncle, you don't mean that. I am sure I do. Merry Christmas. What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough. Come then," said the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough." Bah! And followed it up with a Humbug. Don't be cross, Uncle. What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer. If I had my will, every idiot that goes around with Merry Christmas on his lips would be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly in his heart. Uncle, nephew, you keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine. Keep it, but you don't keep it. Let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do you, much good it has ever done you. But there are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. I have always thought of Christmas time as a good time, a forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, when men and women seem of one consent to open their shut-up hearts and to think of people below as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of silver or gold in my pockets, I believe it has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it. The clock and the tank involuntarily applauded. Let me hear another word from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into politics. Don't be angry, Uncle. Come dine with us tonight. Bah! But why? Why did you get married? Because I fell in love. Because you fell in love, growled Scrooge, as if it were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than Merry Christmas. Good afternoon. I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. But I keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, Merry Christmas, Uncle. Good afternoon. And a Happy New Year. Good afternoon. The nephew left without an angry word notwithstanding, but stopped at the outer door and bestowed a Merry Christmas Bob Cratchit towards the clerk. Merry Christmas, sir, said the clerk. There's another fellow, my clerk, with 15 shillings a week, a wife and a family, talking about a Merry Christmas. With the nephew's exit, two other people entered the shop. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. Scrooge or Marley, I believe, said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago, this very night. We have no doubt his liberality would be represented by his surviving partner, said the other gentleman, presenting his credentials. Bah! Oh, at this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, said the gentleman, taking out his pen, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly in these present times. Many thousands are in want of common comforts, necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Are there no prisons? Plenty of prisons. And the union houses, are they still in operation? If they are, still I wish I could say that they were not. And the treadmills and the poor law are in full vigor then? Both very busy, sir. Oh, I was afraid from what you had said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I'm glad to hear it. You have not the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitudes. A few of us have endeavored to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is of all the times of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall we put you down for? Nothing. Oh, you wish to remain anonymous? I wish to be left alone. I don't make myself merry at Christmas. I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help support the establishments you have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. It is not my business. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not interfere in other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labors with an improved opinion of himself. Meanwhile, the fog and darkness thickens. The cold became intense. In the main street at the corner of the court, some laborers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier around which a party of ragged men and boys were gathering, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. The owner of one scamped young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold as bones are gnawed by dogs, pulled himself up on Scrooge's window ledge to regale him with a Christmas carol. God rest ye merry gentlemen, and not leave you dismay. Scrooge seized a ruler, striking with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the window to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk. You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose. It's quite convenient, sir. It is not convenient, and it is not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. The clerk smiled faintly. And yet you don't think me ill-used to pay a day's wages for no work? Why, it's only once a year, sir. Got poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Bah! But I suppose you must have the whole day. You'll be here all the earlier the next morning. Yes, sir, said the clerk. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, went down a slide on Corn Hill in honor of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play a blind man's bluff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his bank of books, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering brick of building up a yard. It was old enough and dreary enough for nobody lived there but Scrooge, the other rooms being let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. Now it is a fact that there is nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and day during his whole residence in that place. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without it undergoing any immediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Yes, Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible. Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, and it was no longer a knocker. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause for a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on. So he said, "Bah, bah," and closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went. It was dark, and Scrooge liked the dark. It's cheap. But before he shut the heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that all was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. A small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and a little saucepan of gruel. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in my dressing gown, which was hanging up at a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he crossed to his door, locked himself in, double locked himself in, put on his dressing gown and slippers, his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. He sits and he paces, and he sits and he paces. After several turns, he sat down again. His glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that, as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly on the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did all the bells in the house. It might have gone on for half a minute or a minute, but it seemed like an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun altogether. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if someone was dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise coming louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs straight towards his door. "I'm not scared," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His color changed, though, when without a pause it came through the heavy door and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as if to cry, "I know him! Marley's ghost!" The same face, the very same face, Marley, in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail, and his coat, skirt, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail. It was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Though he felt the chilling influence of its dead cold eyes, he was still incredulous and fought against his senses. Now, what do you want with me?" "Mudge." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" "I can." "Do it then." "You don't believe in me." I don't know. Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because little things can affect them. You might be a slight disorder of the stomach. You might be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than a grave about you, whatever you are. Humbug, I tell you. Humbug. Do you believe in me or not? Mercy, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind. Do you believe in me or not? I do. I must. Then why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me? It is required of every man and woman that the spirit within them should walk abroad among their fellow man and travel far and wide. If that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Woe is me. And witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness. You are fettered, said Scrooge, trembling. Tell me why. I wear the chain I forged in life, link by link, yard by yard. Yours was full and long, heavy as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. Do you recognize it? Speak comfort to me, Jake, but I have none to give. I cannot rest. I cannot linger. My spirit never walked beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole. And a weary journey lies before me. Not to know that no space of regret may make amends for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I, such was I. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob. Business! Mankind was my business. Charity, mercy, benevolence were all my business. Marley held up the chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all his unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground before Scrooge. Scrooge was very dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Don't be hard upon me, Jacob. Pray, my time is nearly gone. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. You were always a good friend to me. Thank ye. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Is that the hope and chance you mentioned? It is. I think I'd rather not. Couldn't I take them all at once and have it done, Jacob? Expect the first to knock tomorrow when the bell tolls 1, the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night at the final stroke of 12. Look to see me no more. Remember what has passed between us, Ebenezer. Remember what has passed between us. Remember. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached the window, it was wide open. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out, and the air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might have been guilty governments, were linked together. None was free. Many Scrooge had personally known. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant whom he saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all, clearly, that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell, but they and the spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and tried to say hum, but the syllable stopped in his mouth. And being from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigue of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed and fell asleep on an instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that, looking out of the bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent windows from the opaque walls of his chamber. A neighboring church bell struck the 4 quarters, so he listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went on to 12, then stopped. 12? It was past 2 when I went to bed. The clock is wrong. The icicles must have got into the works. 12. Why is it possible that I could have slept through the whole day and far into another night? It isn't possible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon? The idea being an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. All he could make out was that it was still very foggy and extremely cold, and that there was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably should have been. Bah! Scrooge went to bed again, and thought, and thought, and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he tried not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, his mind flew back again. Was it a dream or not? Then he remembered on a sudden that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. Bum, 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 bum. A quarter past, said Scrooge, counting. Bum, 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 bum. Half past. Bum, 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 bum. A quarter to it. Bum, 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 bum. The hour itself and nothing else. He spoke before the hour bell had sounded. Kadong! And the curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as an old man, viewed through a supernatural medium. The figure, dressed in white, and from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light. The figure itself fluctuated in its distinctiveness, being now a thing with one arm, now with one arm, now with no arms, now with 20 arms, now with a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which the dissolving parts no outline could be visible in the dense gloom wherein they all melted away. And in the very wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever. Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me? Asked Scrooge. I am, said a soft, gentle voice. Who and what are you? I am the ghost of Christmas past. Whose past? Your past. What business brings you here? Your welfare. Yes, much obliged. But I can't help but think that a night of unbroken rest would be more conducive to that end. Your reclamation, then? Take heed. Reaching out its hand, said, rise and walk with me. I think I'd rather not. Bear but a touch of my hand here, placing it upon his heart, and you shall be upheld in more than this. As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon a country road with fields on either side. The city had entirely vanished. It was a clear and wintry day with snow upon the ground. Good heavens, said Scrooge as he looked about him. I was a boy here. I was bred in this place. Scrooge was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts and hopes and joys and cares long, long forgotten. Your lip is trembling. What is that upon your cheek? Nothing. Nothing. Lead me where you will. You recollect the way? Remember it? I could walk it blindfolded. Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on. They walked along the road, Scrooge recognizing every gate and post and tree, until a little town appeared in the distance, and its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were trotting towards them with boys upon their backs, who called to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirit and shouted to each other until the broad fields were full of merry music from the crisp air that laughed to hear it. These are but shadows of things that have been, said the ghost. They have no consciousness of us. The jocund travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why was he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them? Why did his cold eyes glisten and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with gladness when he heard them give each other a Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways as they headed towards home? What was Christmas time to Scrooge? What good had it ever done him? The school is not quite deserted, said the ghost. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still. Yes, yes. I remember, said Scrooge, and he sobbed. They left the high ground by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with a little weathercock-surmounted cupola on the roof and a bell hanging in it. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes. Entering the dreary hall and glancing through the open doors of many rooms, they found them poorly furnished, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. The spirit touched him on the arm and pointed to his younger self, intent upon his reading. Poor boy, said Scrooge, looking at his former self. I wish... What is the matter? Nothing. Nothing. There was a boy singing Christmas carols at my window last night. I should like to have given him something, that is all. The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so, let us see another Christmas. Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and aged before their very eyes. And there Scrooge was, older and alone. The other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. This Scrooge version was pacing up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost and then, with a mournful shake of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. The door opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in and putting her arms around his neck and often kissing him, said, Dear brother, dear brother, dear brother, dear brother! I have come to take you home, home, home for good and all, home forever and forever. Father is so much nicer than he used to be. That home is like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed that I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home. And he said, yes, you should. And he sent me with a coach to bring you, and you're to be a man and never to come back here. But first, we are to be together all Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world. The girl began to drag him in the childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her. Always a delicate creature, whom a breath might have withered, said the ghost. But she had a large heart. So she had. You're right about that. I will not gainsay it. God forbid. She died a woman, and had, I think, children. One child. True. Your nephew. Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind and answered briefly, yes. At that moment, they left the school behind them, and now they were in a busy thoroughfare of a city. It was plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time again. It was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse and asked Scrooge if he knew it. Know it? Why, I apprenticed here. They went in. At sight was an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been inches higher, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling. Why, it's old Fezziwig, bless his heart, old Fezziwig, alive again. Fezziwig had laid down his pen, looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, laughed all over himself, from his shoes to his organ of benevolence, and cried out in a comforting, jovial voice, "Hi-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, came bristling in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. Why, that's Dick Wilkins, to be sure. Lo, my boys, no more work today. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's shut her up before a man can say, Jack Robinson. You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters. 1, 2, 3. Had them up in place. 4, 5, 6. Barred and pinned them. 7, 8, 9. And came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hi-ho, Dick. Cheer up, Ebenezer. The floor was swept and washed, and the lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you could desire to have upon a winter's night. In came the fiddler with the music book, and went upon the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. On came 6 young followers whose hearts they had broken. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's partner, particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, trying to hide behind the girl from next door. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing and some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. And there were more dances, and there were forfeits, and more dances, and there was cake, and there was negus, and there was great pieces of cold roast, and there was great pieces of cold boiled, and there was minced pie, and plenty of beer. And there were the greatest effort of the evening came when the roast and the boiled and the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple, too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 or 20 pairs of partners, people who were not to be trifled with, people who knew how to dance. But if there had been twice as many, 4 times, old Bessie would have been a match for them. And so would Mrs. Fezziwig. A positive light appeared to issue from her calves. They shone in every part of the dance, like moons. When the clock struck 11, the domestic ball broke up and Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everyone had retired but the two apprentices, they did the same to them. His former self turned down the lamps, and the gaiety was over. "Small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. Small. He has spent but a few pounds of his mortal money. 3 or 4, perhaps. It isn't that. It isn't that. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our lives light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it had cost a fortune. My time grows short. Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom he could see, but produced an immediate effect. For again, Scrooge was himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of latter years, but had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion in his eyes, which showed the passion that had taken root, and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in mourning clothes, in whose eyes there were tears. Her name is Belle. Yes. Another idol has replaced me, she said softly. And if it can cheer and comfort you in the times to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no cause to grieve. What idol has replaced you? A golden one. This is the even-handed dealings of the world. There is nothing in which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not? What then? Even if I have grown much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. You have changed. But today, tomorrow, yesterday, can ever I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You who weigh everything by gain and loss. I release you with full heart for love of him you once were. May you be happy in the life you have chosen. She left him, and they parted. Spirit, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me? I told you, these are shadows of things that have been, that they are what they are. Don't blame me. Remove me. I cannot bear it. He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face in which, in some strange way, there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it. Leave me! Take me back! Haunt me no more! Scrooge, observing that the light was burning high and bright, and dimly connected that with the influence over him, he seized a light extinguishing cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it so that the extinguisher covered its whole body, and though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light which streamed from under it with unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an inexplicable drowsiness, and further of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze in which his hand relaxed, and having barely had time to reel to bed before he fell into a heavy sleep. must be intermission.